We are live in the Asia Tech Podcast studio. My name is Graham Brown. Almost got that wrong. Off the bat, what a start. Tuesday evening. Joined for the first time in the studio, Alex Crompton.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Back again, Priyanka.
Hi.
Adkani, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Excellent. Great to have you here. We're going to talk about, well, we've got a lot to talk about. What we're going to talk about, the whole Southeast Asian tech ecosystem. FinTech week here in Singapore this week. And also the latest data on the Southeast Asian startup ecosystem. Alex and Priyanka are here to impart their wisdom and opinions, staying on the safe side.
Yeah,
We've briefed them off air. So, you at FinTech this week?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of events going on this week, along with the FinTech forum, and 40,000.
40,000 people. Yeah, did you go last year?
Yes, I did. Yeah. But this year is taking it up a notch, and they're certainly doing a good job in doing that. And moved out. They're at the expo.
Can you actually get anything done with 40,000 people?
Yeah, I can't answer that. There's been interesting feedback coming from people going. Yeah.
Stay away.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you go, but if you're organised, it works, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Alex, are you a big event guy yourself?
No, actually, yeah, maybe it's controversial, but I have been to almost no tech conferences ever. I'll occasionally go if I'm like talking or something like that, but like literally only for that bit. And I think there's nothing wrong with them from an ecosystem perspective. I think that's super helpful to like bring people in and get them to think about the ecosystem in a different way. But I think like if you're building a company, if your customers aren't there, like what are you doing there?
Yeah.
For me, it's just like networking with other people building companies that are not mine is like not the priority, right?
Not what it's about.
Yeah.
Well, there's plenty of distractions, right? So, okay, we're going to talk about ecosystems today. As I said, there's quite a bit of data that's come out over the last few weeks, which we want to share. Before we get going, I think we have to talk about Singles Day, because it is the big e-commerce event of the year. Did you buy anything this year?
I did actually.
As a result of Singles
But
Day?
mainly just because I'm totally addicted to Amazon Prime.
Right.
So,
but that's not Singles Day, though.
I don't know. They had enough sales, I think. There's always a sale. Does that not count?
I don't think that class is Alibaba Singles Day.
Oh,
no.
I see.
Yeah, that would be classed as oppositional competition.
All
Right?
right. Loads of people in our office. We have a social media influencer who works on our team.
Right.
Not influencing but influencing for themselves. And they were doing loads of like Instagram adverts and corralling people to try and spend money on it. So
We're here in Singapore.
Yeah.
What, for Lazada?
There's like a bunch of different companies that seem to be cross-promoting.
Yeah, they get super active, don't they?
Yeah.
That's the aim. He wants to get it global, so
Yeah.
he's doing a good job of that to start with.
Yeah, awesome. Yourself, Priyanka, did you buy? You stay away.
No, for many reasons.
Right. Sanity.
Well, there's plenty of reasons. I just don't need anything, to be honest. I was sitting there
Wait till you
sitting
sit
there.
with a social media influencer.
Yeah, I was sitting there on Saturday. I'm like, I should buy something. Like, what do I need? What do I need for Christmas? What do we need? What do we need
For Christmas? It's too early. Well, let's have a look at the latest data, because the latest data is coming out, and we're going to flash this news story. This is Bloomberg. But the data here is that they cashed in $30 billion on the day. And what's interesting is, I'm just looking through the numbers here, that they did, according to Alibaba, they did in the first minute and a half, $1 billion in the first minute and a half of trading. I mean, it's just phenomenal, isn't it? And what's interesting about the story, obviously, the expectations have built up so much now, and Alibaba are no longer an unknown. But they said that it only grew 27% this year or last year. I mean, just think about that. It only grew by, $10 billion over last year, or more, or a bit less than that, 7 or 8 billion, 27%, when they're expecting 40% from the last year. So it's phenomenal. I mean, if you compare it here as well, we've got the comparison to Black Friday, which is obviously the big event here. So if you're listening in the podcast, let me explain this comparison chart between Singles Day, which is obviously Alibaba's thing, and Black Friday, which is not an Amazon thing, that's just generic American thing, isn't it?
Yeah, Amazon has like Prime Day. I don't think it's
Right.
like Black Friday. They have all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so Black Friday's been around for a while, but Black Friday's only $10 billion. And obviously now Alibaba's 3 times that. It's just phenomenal, the amount of sales that they're driving. And if you look at e-commerce now, they're saying that 59% of the world's e-commerce now takes place in China. 59% in one market alone. So obviously China at the top of the billing today, but we're not all talking about China tonight. We're going to move on and talk about Southeast Asia. Priyanka, you brought an interesting story here from Business Times. Let's start with that one. Now that we've got the China data out the way, because we're going to come back to China, I suppose, later on when we look at the Global Entrepreneurship Index. This is a study coming from Westpac and Austrade. This data here about the Southeast Asian market and people looking at getting into Southeast Asia. What was interesting about this for you?
Yeah, I mean, this is was done by the Economist Intelligence Unit. Number one, it's just a good topic for us to talk to, given that it's the FinTech festival this week, and might segue into some of our other topics around whether Singapore's ecosystems are robust or not at the moment. But it's especially from a FinTech perspective, this report was launched yesterday. And interestingly, there's 2 key things that they talked through, and one of those being that when you want to come into a new market, the partnerships angle from the fintechs that they interviewed and have done this research report in is about how to find partners and how important it is in this region to be able to find partners from a fintech perspective. That was number one priority, I think. And the second one being there's a lot of conversation around regulation, and that being in some markets difficult, some markets easy, such as Singapore's fintech regulation market is fantastic. But on the panel that was produced yesterday, they actually said a lot of the experts turned around and said it's not regulation. That's just a proxy for you not doing the proper due diligence and how to market entry and how do you get the right information. So I thought it was quite an interesting topic, something for everyone to do a bit more research on, and obviously the report will be linked through that.
Was it specifically Australian focus, this report?
ASEAN, not Australian. So
it was done by Australian companies, though.
Well, sponsored by Australian companies, but with an ASEAN outlook. So I don't even think there was an Australian company in the mix.
Oh, okay. So I was just looking at who was conducted on behalf of Westpac and Austrade.
Yep.
Right. So, but you come from that world, obviously you're Australian. You've worked for an Australian bank before.
It was from Westpac.
Okay,
so I'm a Westpac alum.
Right.
So that's what I've coined the term as. But this is about how other markets, Australia being one, but other markets being anywhere, coming into ASEAN and using the ecosystems that are actually in ASEAN in the fintech perspective. What do you need to do to get into there? Because here they're looking for customer growth, but also market growth in terms of coming into the region. I know I was at from a non-fintech perspective, I was at the there's lots of these startup ecosystem days, and there's plenty of startups that are coming from all of Europe and the States, and they're all coming here to get funded. And I think that's probably something you'd know more about.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting for us. So we are the kind of first investor in all the companies that we fund, because we have this kind of unique model of taking people pre-company and helping them build companies together. And I think 2 years ago, when we were in the US, a bunch of our investors are from the US, some of the big kind of value funds. I don't think people really had a Southeast Asia strategy for investment. And certainly wasn't something that you would hear founders in Europe or certainly founders in the US talking about. But obviously, whether it's the economic or kind of population demographic shifts that we're experiencing here, it's something which is kind of inevitably a bad place to lose, right? Whether you realize you're losing it or not. So I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that people are now sort of trying to land grab like capture the market in different ways. It feels like every like deck you see at the moment from various companies will end up somewhere in like, how do we bank the unbanked in wherever it is. So like, yeah, people are definitely thinking about that kind of stuff. And I think it obviously makes sense because it's like one of the biggest opportunities that's still left. And if you miss it, you miss it, right?
Well, we're going to talk a lot more about Southeast Asia tonight. Obviously, we're based here in Singapore. I'm curious because we've come from different parts of the world into Singapore through different sort of like routes as well. You've come from Australia, you've come from the UK, and myself from the UK originally. And then it's interesting because Australia geographically is closer, if you can say that, to Singapore. I mean, it's still very, very far away, but it seems to be the natural jumping off point for a lot of startups now. Whereas in Europe, and even in the US, it's still a different world, isn't it, Southeast Asia? There's still many other places you could go. Whereas I see a lot of Australian talent coming to Singapore now, whereas maybe in the past they went to London if they were in banking. Now people are saying, well, Singapore seems to be as good an option for a young, bright Australian looking at sort of forging their career than maybe then going to London these days. I'm just wondering what the sort of the word on the street is for those people back in Melbourne or Sydney that are thinking about going global, because all Australians seem to do that, right, at some point. Are they now sort of considering coming to Singapore as like a number one option? Are we there yet?
I don't. My experience with working with the banks here is just that I haven't experienced that in the last couple of years. I think they've been coming to Asia for many, many years. So I think that's already been done. There is much more government support for that. So Singapore and Australia's governments have made great, agreements to do that, to foster the relationships here. There's launch pads, etc. So I don't think that's necessarily an issue, but I think there's lots of European and American and North American companies coming down here actually.
Slowly, they're coming.
Well, there's I was at Rakuten Techstars, and they had a full display of companies from Hungary, from Canada, from they were from everywhere. Yeah.
But are people talking about, if you went back to London now, I don't know when the last time you went back, but are people talking about Singapore, Southeast Asia?
Going back on Friday, actually.
You go back on Friday, so we can put this to the test.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's interesting. So you can apply from anywhere to do EF. We have our office in London, which is where we started. Singapore's our second office. We have offices now in Berlin, in Paris, Hong Kong, Bangalore. And so, you can join kind of wherever you want in theory. And it's interesting for me to think about like what are the like systematic advantages that you have if you start a company in one place over another. I think something that we have observed, I would say, is that like certainly here, in the case where you're in a regulated market, for example, it's much more advantageous to start than if you're in some of the kind of like older bureaucracies in Europe. Like in healthcare, for example, we have a bunch of great healthcare companies that have come out of Singapore. We actually almost, we're like washing our hands of healthcare to a certain extent in the UK because it's just so difficult to get started.
Right.
The hospitals don't really have the power. The regulator is like much more challenging to work with. And because the government here is so pro-business, because there's like a push to be at the forefront of things, you can just move really quickly relative to other places when they are involved. And so we have a bunch of people who've come from Europe to start companies in Singapore, especially when it's in a regulated market like finance or healthcare, because you can actually do it.
Right. Yeah. Right, are they coming here for what reason, though? Because, I mean, if you went back 10 years, the reason they would have been coming here was for tax, right? Mostly because you could have had a Singaporean, Sinco, which would have paid very low corporation tax and so on. Now it's different, isn't it? Now people are coming here, like you said, because there's real opportunity rather than just financial savings to be made. Yeah,
I mean, so I'll give you an example. So we have a company called Oncolize. They essentially allow doctors to personalize the way that they use like chemotherapy treatments, which is like if you can do that, really is transformative for how those people experience that treatment, because it's obviously very traumatic, and there are ways that you can make it much less so. And one of the founders was a PhD student, PhD grad from NUS or NTU, I think actually NTU. And the other was a guy who was from the UK originally, had been doing like healthcare companies in Europe and like finding it really tough. And he was like, actually, you know, the problems in the rest of the world are like just as big, right? And so like, where is the best place for me to address them? And he saw that we had had success with healthcare companies in Singapore before. And so for him, that was like a great role model. And I think there are now enough role models in certain sectors that you can genuinely make a case to say that it might make sense to move from wherever you are, even if that ecosystem is also good, like London startup ecosystem is good, right? But there are just structural advantages that you have here in some cases.
Well, let's talk about that, because that bridges nicely into the next article which you brought, Alex. Is Singapore's early startup scene dead?
Yeah.
Being controversial now. Let's flip it on its head. Let's bring this one up. This is from E27. And I think sort of the nub of this article is that because Singapore's been very much a planned startup scene to some extent compared to other ecosystems, that can only go so far, right? You can only do so much in terms of government planning and policy and, you know, removing red tape and building infrastructure and so on. At some point, you have to have that grassroots hustle.
Right.
So what is this article talking about? What was the sort of point? Why did you think this was interesting?
Well, I mean, I thought it was interesting just because often in startup land, it pays to be like ridiculously optimistic. And so I thought it was, you know, it's by someone who's like relatively involved in the ecosystem, and I thought it was like a really honest view of how he thinks things are going.
This is Derwin Ho from Startup Weekend. Right?
Yeah.
So.
And so, you know, the thing that I thought was interesting about it is, I suppose, like something that I've observed a lot in different ecosystems that we've been involved in, which is this kind of conflation, I think, of cause and effect. So like in Silicon Valley, there have been like tons of successful organizations at supporting companies and, you know, investing in them and all that kind of thing. And I suppose the key question for me, given that we operate at this like ridiculously early, like pre-company point, is, you know, are those institutions, are those investors the cause, or are they effect? Are they the effect of having great companies? And I think, you know, he talks in the article about how we used to have a bunch of great seed funds in Singapore that have kind of moved to later stages, started, you know, Series A and later even. And I think like part of the reason for that maybe is that, you know, funds, accelerators, incubators, angel groups, all these kinds of things, they only really make sense if there are good companies that exist in the first place. And none of them create good companies. They're just there. They're there as an effect, as like an emergent phenomenon on top of great companies, right? And so that's why I thought it was interesting, because I think it gets at the heart of something which is really important, which is actually like you can build as many buildings as you want, you can have as many accelerator programs as you want, you can have all of this stuff, but unless really good people are starting really good companies, in the end, at some point, you'll kind of just have built a load of stuff that doesn't move the needle, right?
Empty offices, right?
Right. Yeah. And I don't think that's where we're at all. But I think it's a really important perspective to maintain, especially when you have, you know, 40,000 people turning up to a conference. Like, you can do that for so long, and then you have to have like a big FinTech company, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is like something which, you know, I think within government in Singapore, people will be talking about a lot over the next few years. It's like, did all that investment pay off or not?
So where does that come from?
Well,
Where do those people come from? From Australia, from London?
Well, I mean, just to add on that point, I also think what's happened is the article did say it was a part of a cycle, you know, ebbs and flows. But interestingly, what we're seeing has been a lot of failures. And a lot of investors, my opinion is a lot of investors are now being more cautious as a result of actually seeing those failures, and quite big failures in this market. So maybe one of those reasons why they're moving on to the larger investments and the more established and the ones that are actually making money, good business ideas is also because that practice of, you know, putting your money wherever you could and crossing your fingers and hoping for it has burnt them. That's sort of my view of, and that's the sort of conversations that I have in the market around investments. Yeah,
I think it's evolving, isn't it?
Yeah,
and that's absolutely evolving. What is interesting is that groundswell of entrepreneurs that isn't being grown locally. I think this is, where are those guys coming from? And I wonder, this for me is like, you can invest all that money, create all that infrastructure, but there's only so much that you can bring from the outside. I mean, we're sitting here, 3 entrepreneurs who've started businesses in Singapore. We've all come from the outside. There's a bit of a sample bias here in our networks, obviously. But we need Singaporeans to start businesses. And, when there's a DBS bank to work for, or a Raja and Tan, for example, why am I going to go and risk my CPF funds to go and start a startup, right? So that compared to, for example, and we're going to talk about entrepreneurship indexes as well, compared to, let's say, Shanghai, you go there, everybody's hustling. They talk about the 996, don't they? Chinese people start at 9, finish at 9, and work 6 days a week. And you're competing against that. And that is the average. And people are hustling, starting startups.
Yeah.
Where is that hustle, that raw hustle here in Singapore, or even in Southeast Asia? I mean, you go to Jakarta, you'll see it, right?
So for me, this is really interesting. Like, this is the kind of essence of what we do at Entrepreneur First. So, like, our belief is, I guess, that if you look at Silicon Valley, and you say, why is it that they have been so successful relative to everywhere else in the world? Well, it's basically because the best people who are coming out of that location decide that they're going to build companies, or the best people that want to start companies go to that location to build them.
Yeah.
And so really the question is, like, how do you change that mentality? What is the way that you unlock the people in the rest of the world who are also great, but are just doing something different, right? And I think the answer to that has to be around like a culture shift that you create through a different kind of opportunity. Like, why did you take your life path? Like, well, 200 years ago you were in something totally different because of the culture that you're in, and you took it because of that moment and that circumstance. And so, our view is that actually, if you address the individual ambitions that people have, if you address the individual needs that they have, whether that's like, we provide a stipend. So essentially it's like, we pay you to figure out if you can start a company, and then we invest in it if you can do that. So, it's financially completely risk-free. You don't need a co-founder, you don't need an idea, you don't need any of this stuff. And so it's literally like, yeah, you can go work at some cool job that your parents will think is nice, or you can take 3 months, have a crack at it, and if you get something that's good, like, great, and if you don't, then you go do the cool job. But
can you do that across a whole society?
I think you can.
You think so? I mean, could a government do that?
Well, I think, so we do it now for about 1,000 people a year around the world.
Right.
And they've done really well. I mean, our portfolio is relatively young, but, even when we were funding like 50 people a year, that portfolio is now worth billions of dollars. And so it's kind of, it seems implausible, but if you find, 50 crazy people who are absolutely amazing, if you find them, every 6 months and they build like 5 companies, you need one of those to work out. And I totally think that's possible.
And does the payoff come longer term when those sort of 5 people or the 50 then go back into the ecosystem? That's kind of what we need in Singapore, isn't it? We've got a lot of the top-down stuff, but you've mentioned Silicon Valley. What they have is a generation of angel investors who are willing to take risks, right?
Yeah.
We're still sort of like learning a little bit here on that front, aren't we? We don't have people who will, I'll throw 50 grand into a company because I believe in startups. We don't really have a lot of that here, right?
Yeah, it's super interesting though. So I'm good friends with Xiaoning and Dashing, who started Job Central. They actually work with both of them, so like full disclosure. But they recently have kind of formalized this thing called Angel Central, and I think it's super interesting what they're doing. It's essentially an angel group, but they make it really, really easy for people from lots of different backgrounds to both understand and invest in early stage companies in a sensible way. And I think that actually opens up the ecosystem to like a different kind of genuinely incentivized help. It's not like you're going down to an incubator and you're doing like mentoring for an afternoon. It's like, it's real money, as in you put something on the line, but it definitely brings people together in a different way. And because they have the expertise of starting a company which was really successful, they're able to share that expertise and share that excitement and kind of front load some of that like genuinely incentivized ecosystem building in a way that I think is really cool and interesting. So yeah, I totally agree that you see that like network effect in Silicon Valley, but I think there are a bunch of people that are doing a good job at actually replicating it. Yeah,
well, let's have a look. Let's take it around Asia, because we're going to look, Southeast Asia in particular. We're going to have a look at this article by Nikkei, which is pretty in depth. They've basically done a one-on-one on every single tech hub ecosystem. I know they've marked them out and put the nail in the coffin by saying become the next Silicon Valley. But anyway, take that aside. These are all the tech ecosystems in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular, and it starts off obviously with Singapore. Then we'll have a look at Bangkok and et cetera, Ho Chi Minh, and it goes on to basically cover the main ones. Jakarta is in there as well. What's really interesting about this is that it sort of analyzes it with numbers about the number of tech startups in each city, which I thought was quite interesting. Even though their data only goes up to 2016, or sometimes they like forward project the data and so on. But I think
number of companies, one of those amazing vanity metrics.
Yeah, well, exactly.
How many people can you get to a FinTech farm?
40,000. Do they all count? So it's interesting. I mean, for example, just quickly run through the numbers and then I'll hand it over to you, Alex, because this was your article. Is that, top line data here, Singapore. I know it's not sort of comparing like with like, 4,300 tech startups in 2016. All right. Obviously, it's important. Jakarta, government aiming for 1,000 startups by 2020. Seems a bit strange, that number there. I would have thought, Jakarta would be a lot higher. And then Thailand, 750. There's Penang in here, which is obviously often overlooked. 900 in Malaysia in general. And then Ho Chi Minh City, about 3,000, it says. It's all very vague, but comparisons there. I think quite inaccurate as well, though. But the point is, there's a lot of activity going on. So let's put it all out there. Those are the tech hubs in Asia, Southeast Asia, racing to become the next Silicon Valley. Why was this interesting?
Yeah, so I thought it was super interesting because I think it probably, the way that they present it, I think creates like a relatively skewed view. So they talk about like number of companies. There's like the absolute number of funding that those companies have raised in total. And I think it's super easy from the like hype that you get around the ecosystem to then say like, oh, Singapore is like growing like crazy or whatever, right? But really the thing that determines these numbers a lot of the time, or how important the ecosystem is like, what is the scale of the winner? And, if you look at that distribution, I think it talks about, over $1 billion or whatever is invested in VC in Singapore. And it's like the distribution of that $1 billion really matters, because that tells you something about the structure of the ecosystem. And so for me, I think it's really a question of like, what are the biggest companies that are emerging from these ecosystems? Like, how are they able to actually be relevant on a global scale? Like, of that like $1 billion, how much of it is going to 2 or 3 companies? How much of it is being spread and then failing or whatever? And I think it just highlights how difficult it is to actually like draw any conclusions from this stuff until the movie is played out, right?
Yeah.
In a couple of years.
If you were to sort of map it as a population type pyramid, the distribution of funding by ecosystem. I know this is, completely live and ambushing you. How do you think these will look like, city by city? Would they look fundamentally different? You talked, for example, like you could have a lot of money invested in one ecosystem with VC, but it may just be with like 3 or 4 big players, like maybe Singapore's like that, right? Are there sort of fundamentally different shapes across Asia?
Well, I think one of the fascinating things is maybe, to reframe it a bit, is if you were to look at it not just in terms of like financial amounts of money, but also in terms of who is investing and where they're investing from. So, we see a lot of, in this region, we see a lot of external funds and external companies that are kind of coming in and playing kingmaker. A friend of mine runs a company, and he said that, another like similar kind of competitor company in China, but that was further down the road, had more money, kind of came in and was like, here are the competitors in these markets that we think are relevant for us at some point in the future. If you don't take our money, then we'll give it to your competitor. So you're kind of forced to end up ceding control to in these kind of like slightly nefarious ways. And so I think you see more of that kind of thing happening outside Singapore because the kind of growing population markets are the areas that like China's and SoftBanks and all those kind of people really care about winning. But the interesting thing for me is that I think we see a lot of our companies in Singapore having a natural next market in the US, for example. And so it's not...
rather than Indonesia or...
Yeah, it's like less obvious to me that there's like a big parallel between like Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia. I don't know if it actually is this like landing pad for the rest of the market. I think there's like... it's emerging that there are like different kinds of companies that you can build in different places. Like one is this like consumer internet story growth thing that you get in certain parts of Southeast Asia, and the other is like, hey, we have two of the best universities in the entire world like on our doorstep right here, and they're doing a bunch of cool stuff. Why aren't they making companies like MIT, right? And those kinds of companies have a very different future and very different investor base, very different funding outcomes than the like Indonesia growth story companies.
Yeah, fascinating. Priyanka, I know you have an interest in many different Asian markets. Obviously, you're very focused on Singapore. Last time you were here, we talked a bit about Vietnam as well. When you look at this list from the FinTech perspective, what are your thoughts? I mean, Singapore obviously captures a lot of the headlines, doesn't it? Is there anything else in Asia that's worth, you know, Southeast Asia in particular, that's doing stuff in FinTech of note?
Oh, I mean, there's the fintech opportunity. I mean, in the report that we've seen just here is Myanmar. We talked about that earlier. I don't know whether we were live at the time, but there's certainly plenty of scope in the region here. It's just interesting that I'd like to see that actually placed towards Hong Kong and China. You know, as we just said, we had Singles Day, which is 30 billion. There's plenty of opportunity there. I think someone was doing the math and said, that's like every Chinese person spent at least $30.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. So to your point, it's going to work in different sectors. We'll gravitate towards different markets, whether you need the consumerism or you need the, the education sector or the healthcare. It's going to be different wherever they go.
I think it's going to be super interesting to see. It's like when I first came to Singapore, had a short but very memorable conversation with this guy called quirky who runs Monk's Hill, and he was talking to me about kind of the different types of companies that he sees in the ecosystem, like how he sees it playing out. I think like one of the things that I thought was really interesting is like how difficult it can be actually to scale like the consumer internet style companies that you see in China, for example, or in the US in this market, because actually it's reasonably similar to Europe, where there's immense localization that's necessary. Your infrastructure is likely to look different in each country, and so it can be clunkier than people realize. And so, it's not obvious to me even now that actually the big wins will come from that, even if the population is large, because I think you're likely to see external competitors which have been able to grow big kind of dominate, except in some of these like really interesting but exceptional circumstances, like with the Grab Uber thing, where they were able to kind of force different unit economics by having a broader, more value proposition to their customers. I think it will be fascinating to see whether Southeast Asian companies really win big, or whether actually a lot of that value gets extracted by their investors in other places. Or
well, you look at the big players that pretty much are owned by
one
player. I mean, Lazada as an example, right? So these are the big consumer internet players, right? That they are pretty much owned by Chinese consumer internet players, right? So there you go. I wonder as well. I mean, we talk a lot about Southeast Asia. I mean, really, it's just a geographical entity, isn't it? I mean, it's not sort of, in any way, you can't really compare Singapore to the rest of Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Singapore's got a lot more in common with Hong Kong, for example, in terms of the market, in terms of comparisons and so on. And like you said, like if you were a successful Singapore company, does it make sense that you then go to Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur just because it's next door? Is that the case? Whereas, it may just be better for them to go to the US or take it to Europe, right? If it's more sort of like in line with the kind of consumers that they're after, right?
Yeah, I mean, we went to Hong Kong next. I mean, so our kind of the type of people that we work with are generally from very kind of like academic backgrounds. And so actually Hong Kong is a way better parallel for Singapore than most of the other cities in the region, because like it also has incredible universities, incredible like kind of history of like tech R&D and I think everyone was expecting us to like do Jakarta or something like that. But it's just really different and like terrifyingly so. Right. So I don't know if we're anything to go by, then I don't know if I don't know if it is as easy as people think to like.
Who's actually done that though? I'm trying to even think like anybody who's from Singapore who's actually successfully on the consumer side gone into Indonesia. I mean, as an example, I mean, it seems that, for example, if you take consumer internet, obviously we talked about Grab and Gojek, talked about them quite extensively last time. They've sort of come the other way, haven't they? If anything, You know, I don't know who's gone. I mean, Lazada hasn't gone that way. I mean, they've got their own sort of localized versions of e-commerce there as well. A lot on the sort of the last mile distribution, like Lala and all those kind of people. But again, they sort of come from the outside. They've come from, you know, with backing with China. So who knows? Maybe we'll be proven wrong over time.
Yeah.
Somebody will shout, you know, comments. Now we've done it.
Yeah.
But there's no obvious examples that I know of.
Yeah. I think it also isn't a it isn't like a death knell, even if that's true.
Right.
So like if you look at, as in the UK, for example, you like Oxford and Cambridge, tiny places, but just incredible concentration of really brainy people, has been able to create a ridiculous amount of value comparable to like many of the big city startup ecosystems around the world. Obviously, like Silicon Valley is built around its academic institutions, and you know Singapore is top of the list for that in Asia, right? By some margin. So I don't think even in the case where it turns out that it's very difficult to create really globally relevant, enduring generational companies of the ilk that we've seen in the US or in China here, there are going to be other types of companies that get built that are enduring and generational and important.
Yeah, stop chasing the unicorns, right? There's a lot more out there. So on that note, I want to flash this up because we've got this data. This has come from the Global Entrepreneurship Index. And I want to get your thoughts on this because there are always these sort of ecosystem rankings coming out. And I've put my hand up as well. I've done one of these before. And there's a lot more art than science, I have to confess. But these guys are obviously a lot more credible than me and my spreadsheets. So this is the Global Entrepreneurship Index. And what they've basically done is compiled the Asian startup ecosystems, actually tech ecosystems, and they've ranked them. And how they've sort of come out is just very interesting because whilst we can sort of argue about whether it's the right positioning or not, I think the key is it sort of reinforces a lot of stories out there about entrepreneurship across Asia and generally. And the way it's come out, and I don't know how this is the case, I would like your sort of thought speculation on this. We've got at the top of the Entrepreneurship Index, South Korea, followed by Singapore, then Japan, then China. Silence. Explain. Priyanka, what's going on here? How could that be the case? How could that actually be correct?
I mean, I haven't had a chance to read the how they did it perspective, but you know, Myanmar sitting on the other end of that
that's right.
seems really odd, especially from all the that I hear, and plenty of companies coming out of there, and so. Yeah, I just don't know anything about South Korea, and it's not the first. I've heard a little bit about it, but not a huge amount. So I unfortunately can't comment on that.
We know for a fact that entrepreneurship ranking is not based on entrepreneurship in terms of like, you know, the individual attitudes towards it, right? Because you say like Myanmar, right down there at second to last. Along with a lot of the sort of like the emerging Southeast Asian economies, like, you know, Cambodia, for example, or even Indonesia down there at 12th, you know, how they could be that lowly in terms of entrepreneurship because everybody's, you know, hustling. Everybody's on the make at some point, even India, right? So that can't be sort of in terms of cultural attitudes towards entrepreneurship. Because if that was the case, Japan and South Korea would be right at the bottom. Right, and I've lived in Japan. You know, in Japan, entrepreneurship is very much like an alternative lifestyle. You might as well be a yoga teacher or some crystal healer. That's how it gets accepted there. Exactly. So how is that the case? How could they be the top? And what do you think is useful in terms of these rankings, if at all? Any, you know, having these things, are they useful in any case, and how should we use them?
I don't know whether it's based on investment into the market, because there's certainly a lot of South Korean investment coming along. So that's one thing that I can think about it. The drop in Singapore is probably mirrored to what we were talking about earlier in terms of that cycle. It's probably the best suggestions or examples.
But China has to be at the top.
Yeah,
of that list.
I guess for me it's like with rankings, it kind of like rankings really only matter to people who are not obviously first. As in, like, Silicon Valley doesn't publish rankings saying Silicon Valley is the best. I think if Chinese people saw this, they'd be like, hey, just, like, look at the number of amazing companies that we've put out. Look at the amount of money that is going into this ecosystem. I don't know. I kind of, like, I find it really fascinating being here, actually, because I think there's, like, maybe it's positive insecurity, but I think there is, like, genuine insecurity about, like, oh, we better...
Right.
are we better than Hong Kong? I remember we opened an office in Hong Kong. People were like, when we talk about it in the media, like people would want us to like make a comparison, like a face-off between the two. But it's just like, that isn't the relevant thing, right? The relevant thing is like, startups are winner takes all. Only the biggest and the best companies matter. It's like, do you have those companies? If you don't, you're irrelevant. And like, you know, China has those companies on that list, and like, I bet they don't care about any rankings that anyone makes.
Let's get this back up here again, because I'm going to posit why I think it might be like this. I'm not saying it's the right thing, but I think this may be something to do with innovation. So, for example, Singapore accepted, South Korea and Japan very much have a very strong legacy of corporate innovation, right?
Right.
Yeah, which is, you know, sort of very top-down corporate accelerators, you know, very much about investing in R&D. You know, if R&D equals innovation, then you could look at the books and say, how much do companies invest in R&D? Probably South Korea and Japan are at the top.
Interesting.
Yeah, because, you know, they are tech companies and they have to invest in R&D, even if that R&D is, for example, like making a better version of the CD, which could be the case in Japan, right? So that is their version of ranking it or maybe quantifying it.
I think one of the fascinating things that we see on this, though, is like, you know, there are like multiple emerging internets or academias, and as in, we have this like English-speaking world which we all inhabit, and to some extent, like Europe and other countries have largely conformed to, which is where we talk about things and where we write about things and where they matter. But like there's a guy called Ian Hogarth who's a founder in the UK who's written a bunch of stuff about this recently. It's super interesting. It's like, if you look at this kind of through the lens of like the AI race or the like academic development race, like the pace of publishing in China is growing really, really fast. And that is like a, you know, its own thing in lots of ways. Like there's a lot of knowledge that is being created that we aren't necessarily exposed to or aware of in the same sense. And so like, it wouldn't surprise me if you're right that there's like the spending is allocated in a different way, but like where is the most new knowledge being created? If it isn't already there, I would be amazed if in a few years, like it wasn't obviously coming out of China.
Yeah, I've seen data to like back up your point, and also to, you know, be a nice sort of counterbalance to the data that we put up there. I don't have it. It's going to be ad hoc now, so I'm going to blag it. But here's how it goes. There was a report published which looked at startup activity in Chinese and US cities. It compared them. And it was like the number of startups, not companies, number of startups, so I don't know how it ranked it, by population, per head, right? And it was really interesting because like the top startupiest city in the US was Miami, you know, not San Jose or you know, like anywhere in the valley. And interesting, the top startup city in China was Zhuhai, which is like on the other side from Hong Kong, you know, where the bridge goes across now. But what was really interesting was like the level of activity in the 10th startup city in China was still like 5 times higher than the highest startup city in the US. So like, you know, if you could put them together per head, the US wouldn't have been in the top 50 of cities in China in terms of startup activity. So those are the kind of entrepreneurship rankings I want to see more of. You know, actually what is happening in terms of activity. And there was another one as well. I was at the Startup Launchpad in Hong Kong recently, and there's a lady there called Marta Deveco who does ecosystem reports. She's from the Hong Kong University. And she said, and this is anecdotal again, but she's got research to back this up, so it's in conversation, that in Shenzhen, China, they did a survey of all, a very large survey of people, citizens in Shenzhen, China, and they found that 20% of the adult population in Shenzhen, China, had invested in a startup. Think about that. It's just an insane figure, 20%. It's like you
19% are going to be broke by the end of the year.
Right? It's just that sort of level of, yeah, exactly. I mean, but those are people who accept it, but that kind of level of entrepreneurship. You know, how can you get 20% of the population investing in startups? You know, getting 20% to invest in, even in their own sort of savings fund is something. But I think that's the kind of what's coming next. You know, that is going somewhere. These are the kind of the untold stories from Asia coming out at the moment. We don't kind of hear a lot about outside of Asia.
It's super, super interesting to think about like how different people, different sources of capital will also affect like who can and should start companies as well. Like here we see way more kind of family office activity, or way more angel investors that are like not from a tech background necessarily. And I think that really shapes like how companies get built and what companies get built. And so it'll be and also, I mean, it'll be fascinating to see whether that has like, we talked a bit about like Indonesia, and it's very difficult to try and do a business in Indonesia without at least someone talking to you about how you're going to integrate with any of the like sort of big like family organization things, whatever they are. And I think it'll be really interesting to just see how all of that sort of stuff plays out as well, because it's just like doesn't really exist in the same way in the Valley, doesn't really exist in the same way in Europe, and so there isn't really a precedent for like how to work with, you know, some like 500,000 person like company beast thing that, you know, owns all of the financial infrastructure or whatever, right? Like, how do you do that?
I mean, that's the Asian story is a family business story. My statistics are wrong because I don't have it here, but 70-80% of most stock exchanges are run by like family businesses around Asia. So your point around this being a how do you integrate with those few that are controlling a lot of the country's activities is interesting. But I also think, though, that then makes more thoughtful investors because they're coming from personal, you know, sort of. It's not corporations investing; it's actual family-run businesses and multi-generations family-run businesses that are doing that.
There was a good story last week on Asia Matters about that. A Vietnamese company and family business. They were a drinks business. They rejected a takeover bid from Coke. I think $2.6 billion takeover. So, but still, you know, money talks, even if it is a family, and you're protecting the family legacy. Yeah. 2 billion talks. So, but they said no. And the reason they said no is because they were going to take their business to America and take on Coke. How about that? Yeah. Family business. Yeah. Phenomenal. Watch out for them. Can't remember their name, but watch the last episode. You'll find out more about them.
It's super interesting seeing how it's like one of the things that we've noticed. We've now funded, what will it be, as of last week, more than I think 70 companies in Singapore. And one of the things that we see that's just really striking is at a very, very early stage, because you have a lot of businesses where they're able to be autonomous. It's possible to like get real like customer engagement from companies of a size that you just couldn't in the UK because they've been like bureaucratized. Whereas like if you can get to the family business owner, if you can get to the family and they decide like, hey, this makes sense, we're going to do it, they're like able to push that through at a rate that is really different. So we actually see like people getting traction in this market, particularly in B2B companies, has been really quick. The challenge is that on the flip side, they often want like way tighter integration. So they like want to like buy a stake and want control and all these different kinds of things. And so like, yeah, you can like have their business as in that, you know, they'll like buy stuff off you, but on the other hand, they, you know, it's going to come at a price. And I think like, you know, honestly, that's something that we just haven't observed to the same extent in the UK. I imagine isn't observed to the same extent in the US. And so it will be really interesting to see how all that plays out, whether it's a pro or it's a con, or like how to navigate it. I don't think there's a good like road playbook for it.
No,
it's just that's the relationship that you know, you can name it whatever. Every country has a different name of what that relationship type business happens in Asia, but that's just a stand. That's you know.
But it's like, how does that fit with the conventional model of VC, right? Like, let's say to get your first deal, it might be a big one, but you got to give up 15% of the company, and then suddenly you're going to like your like classic VC model, and they're like, look at your cap table, and they're like, hey, this doesn't make any sense, and you're like, oh, I'm sorry, we had to give 15% of the company to the soil, like our first company who run a like soil business. I don't know. It's like it's like those two worlds collide at some point, and so I don't know how it'll play out.
Well, I think that's where the whole sort of ecosystem's maturing, isn't it? Because they're sort of dancing with each other and learning. The whole thing's getting more professionalized, you know, and that's what Silicon Valley has a lot more of, is, you know, the fact that these people have been doing it for generations, investing, and these family businesses, if they're moving into this space, we're starting to see the second generation people now experimenting with startups, aren't we? So they will learn, they will mature, and that sort of wisdom will be collected, and we'll get better at it. So hopefully that's the plan. Everybody sort of like rises up with that as we learn how it all sort of hangs together.
Yeah.
You know, we don't have that sort of knowledge here in Singapore or even in Southeast Asia like we do in, you know, San Jose or in the Valley.
Yeah. It's been interesting seeing that because, you know, a lot of the time the intention is really positive actually. So we've had, I remember there's one portfolio company of ours, negotiated a deal with the customer. The customer really, really wanted to invest in the company and thought it was a really good thing if they would like put more money in and buy a stake and do all this kind of stuff. But we had to kind of like sit down together and figure out, okay, like if we do this, the implications on this company for like raising VC money are different. And so like it really affects the direction that the company can take way more than you would like naturally expect if you're from like a traditional business world where like everything is self-financed, all that kind of stuff. And so, you know, I think just like we actually do spend a lot of time working with our portfolio companies, their customers, and on these kind of like odd JV things, and the VCs on like trying to make it all like fit together. But like everyone kind of has a different way of thinking about it right now and is going through it for like, you know, not necessarily the first time, but like for with their arms out.
It's new world.
Yeah.
But you said, I mean, you said at the start of the show, you highlighted it. We're entrepreneurs, we're optimists. So it's all just going to work out fine.
Yeah.
And, you know, an entrepreneur taking a deal with an investor often doesn't think that that can implement, you know, that can have implications on the next round. They just think, oh, take the money. That'd be good. Be fine. But they don't realize how that could impact their later stages of funding, right? As I said, we're optimists. It's going to work out.
Yeah. Yeah.
There you go. That was Asia Matters. My name's Graham Brown. I'm joined by Alex Crompton.
Thanks
Great to
me.
have you here.
Yeah,
First time. Thanks for coming into the studio. And Priyanka Nakani, thank you for coming back.
Thank you.
And great to have your insights today and sharing your stories with us. If you want to find out more about Asia Matters, you can check us out at asiamatters.show. We'll be back. We are going to switch to a monthly format now, but you can still follow us and pick up on all the old episodes on iTunes and Spotify now. This is us signing out.